June 23rd, 1834, a Sunday morning in Jefferson County, Mississippi. The day began like any other Sabbath on the Rose Hill plantation, the sound of church bells rising faintly over the humid air, women in pressed linen dresses moving quietly through the fields. Before we continue the video, comment below where you're from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And white families preparing for their weekly mass. Polished, proud, and unaware of the storm that had been sleeping among them for years. But this was not just another Sunday. It was the day 6 white overseers would be found beaten to death, not by an uprising or a revolt, but by one woman, Martha Cooper. Her name never appeared in the official records. They tried to erase it as if silence could rewrite what fire had already written. Yet the people remembered. The quarters whispered her story in secret hymns and late-night murmurs. A story not of madness, but of reckoning. Martha was 31 years old, a house slave who had spent most of her life perfect. In the art of silence. She had learned early to lower her gaze, to speak only when spoken to, and to endure pain without sound. For years she wiped away the blood of others from the white tablecloths of her masters, her hands steady even when her heart trembled. Hebrew, she was a woman carved out of grief and endurance. They had taken her child and sold her away before she could even speak her name. She had watched Jacob, the old man who used to hum freedom songs, found hanging from the branches of a magnolia tree. She had seen young girls dragged into sheds and returned broken, eyes empty of life. Yet through it all, she never screamed, never resisted, never begged. She simply worked, and in that work, something terrible and sacred was being forged. A stillness that was not submission, but strength waiting for its appointed hour. That Sunday, while others prepared for Mass, Martha did not pray. The white families rode away in their carriages, their laughter fading into the distance. The plantation fell into its usual uneasy quiet, except for the 6 overseers who stayed behind. They never went to church. Their God was power, and their scripture was fear. They spent their mornings drinking whiskey by the livestock pens, boasting, cursing, and calling the names of girls who never looked them in the eyes. Inside the kitchen, Martha stood by the window rolling dough, with fingers roughened by heat and ash. The smell of flour and wood smoke filled the room, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her eyes shifted toward the barn, where the laughter of the overseers echoed faintly like a curse carried by the wind. The sound was sharp, cruel, a reminder of every bruise, every lost child, every broken spirit buried beneath that soil. And then, something inside her, something quiet, ancient, and unbreakable, stirred awake. When the church bell rang again in the distance, Martha laid down the rolling pin and walked toward the back storage shed. It was a place she hadn't entered in years. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the scent of ash lingered heavy in the air. In the corner, half buried under soot, lay a wooden stick, the same one she had used for years to stir the stove's embers. She lifted it carefully, her hand tracing the burned edge, the rough grain beneath her fingertips. For a long moment she stood still, eyes closed, breathing the ghosts of memory that filled the room like smoke. Abrook, Jacob, Elsie, Lena. The names returned one by one, each a wound, each a spark. Jacob's humming voice silenced by a rope. Elsie, 12 years old, her small body swollen with pain. Lena, Martha's own daughter, gone before her mother could even bury her. Each name pressed deeper into her chest until her breath trembled. She gripped the stick tighter, and in that single act, years of silence broke. The air outside shimmered with heat. The fields swayed in the distance, their beauty a cruel disguise for the agony beneath. The overseers laughed louder now, their words rue and mean. Martha stepped out from the shed. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked, each step steady as a drumbeat. The dirt beneath her feet seemed to recognize her, as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. She passed the kitchen door, the laundry lines, the barrels of feed, until she reached the edge of the barn. The sound of her footsteps drew a few lazy glances, but no one thought much of her. Martha was invisible to them, the quiet one, the one who never looked up, the one they believed too broken to fight back. But the silence that had once been her prison was now her weapon. Behind those lowered eyes burned the fury of generations. She carried not just her pain, but the weight of every soul who had ever knelt under the whip and whispered prayers into the dirt. As the sun rose higher, its light spilling gold over the fields, Martha Cooper, the woman history tried to forget, lifted the wooden stick in her hand. The day was about to shift, and the world, though it did not know it yet, was about to hear the voice of every cry that had been buried in silence. That morning, Mississippi would tremble, and for the first time, the chains that bound the Rose Hill plantation would crack, not with sound, but with justice. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling light across the white walls of the plantation house. The smell of fried cornmeal and smoke hung in the air. From the barn came bursts of laughter, rough, careless laughter that carried across the yard like the echo of years of cruelty. Martha stood at the edge of the kitchen steps, the wooden stick gripped loosely in her hand. To anyone who might have seen her, she looked the same as always, calm, expressionless, obedient. But inside her, something ancient and fierce had awakened. For 31 years, she had learned to fold her pain into silence, to hide her rage behind lowered eyes. Every command, every blow, every humiliation had been pressed down deep within her like hot iron. But now that heat was rising. It was not madness, it was memory catching fire. She thought of Jacob's voice, hoarse and sweet as he sang to the moon before they found him hanging. She thought of Elsie, barely more than a child, stumbling back from the shed with torn clothes and trembling hands. She thought of her daughter, Lena, whose breath had stopped before dawn, whose small body had been carried away like trash. The stick in Martha's hand was light, familiar, like an old friend. She had stirred ashes with it, scraped burnt bread from the iron oven, beaten rugs clean of dust. She had never imagined it could be a weapon. But that morning it was. Not because she wanted blood, but because blood had been demanded from her people every day without end. This time, the earth itself seemed to beg for balance. Martha walked slowly toward the barn, her bare feet pressed into the warm dirt. The air shimmered with heat and memory. The overseers were gathered by the troughs, bottles in hand, sweat staining their shirts. One of them, Gaines, a thick man with a red neck and a cruel grin, noticed her first. "What you want, girl?" he barked, slapping the rim of the trough. "Ain't no chores here for you." Brr. Martha didn't answer. She kept walking. The others looked up, amused. They had never seen her approach without being called. Bell chuckled and elbowed Pike. "Looks like the quiet one's lost her place," he said. "Maybe she need reminding." Hebrew. Still, Martha said nothing. The stick hung at her side, catching a glint of sunlight. The moment stretched thin, like the second before lightning cracks. When she finally stopped, she looked up. For the first time in years, her eyes met theirs. And something in that gaze, steady, unflinching, alive, made the laughter fade. Gaines frowned. "You deaf woman? Speak!" Martha's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You remember Jacob?" The men glanced at each other confused. Bell snorted. "The old fool? Hung himself, didn't he?" Martha lifted the stick. "No," she said quietly. "You hung him." Before the words could settle, she moved. The first blow cracked against Gaines's skull with a sound like splintering wood. He fell without a cry. The others shouted, scrambled, too slow. The stick swung again, fueled by decades of silence breaking loose. Bell reached for his whip. It never touched her. Pike ran toward the gate, but Martha's arm caught him across the back, the wood striking with the precision of a lifetime's restraint. The air filled with chaos. Dust rising, crows shrieking, the sound of bodies hitting the ground. It was over as suddenly as it had begun. The barnyard lay still except for the soft rustle of flies gathering. 6 men who had believed themselves gods now lay motionless in the dirt. Martha stood above them, breathing hard, the stick blackened and cracked in her grip. Sweat glistened on her forehead. She waited for fear to come, but it didn't. There was only stillness, a deep, clean silence, like the moan. After a storm has passed. For the first time, she felt something she had never known before. Not joy, not sorrow. Freedom. She looked toward the fields. In the distance, the workers had stopped moving. The women and men who had spent their lives bending under orders now stared, wide-eyed, from where they stood. None of them spoke, but in their faces, she saw the same flame that burned inside her. They had all felt this moment coming, even if they hadn't dared to believe it would arrive. Ibrik and Martha dropped the stick. It fell with a dull thud, stirring dust into the air. She turned and began to walk toward the quarters. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she were walking out of one life and into another. Behind her, the fields shimmered gold under the Mississippi sun. The cries of birds echoed across the air, and somewhere in the distance the church bells rang again, their sound hollow now, stripped of meaning. The White families would return soon, dressed in their Sunday finery, expecting supper to be ready and the house to be in order. They would find instead a silence they could not command, and a reckoning they could not undo. Martha did not plan what would come next. She did not think of punishment, or flight, or forgiveness. Her thoughts were simple, clear. She had answered for the ones who could not. She had spoken without words, using the only language they had ever forced her to learn, the language of pain. When she reached the edge of the quarters, the other women stepped aside to let her pass. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. The earth told them what had happened. The air carried it, the same way the songs used to carry their prayers at night. Martha walked to the place behind the kitchen where the ashes from the stove were always thrown out. She knelt, dipped her fingers into the cool gray dust and pressed it to her forehead. Brew, it was done. The sun burned higher, the fields swayed, and the world turned. But somewhere deep in the soil, Mississippi. The ground began to remember her name. Brew. By late afternoon, the air over Rose Hill Plantation had changed. What had once been filled with the rhythm of whips cracking and women's cries was now eerily still. The wind drifted through the fields like a hymn with no words. The church wagons were already rolling back from town, their wheels cutting through the mud as laughter and sermon talk filled the air. The White families were returning home to what they believed would be another quiet Sunday evening. They had no idea that the ground beneath them was already holding the truth of 6 dead men. Martha Cooper stood behind the kitchen house, her hands rinsing in a basin of cold water that had already turned gray. The wooden stick lay broken behind the barn, its splinters soaking in blood and dust. Her body ached, not from fear, but from release. For years she had carried a weight she could not name, and now it was gone. The heaviness had shifted, from her shoulders to the soil. From the quarters, a murmur rose like wind in the reeds. The other slaves had heard. They did not run or scream or celebrate. They simply watched her with eyes full of something new, something that might have been reverence or disbelief. Martha, the quiet one, the invisible one, had done what none had dared. She had turned the whip upon its wielder. When the first carriage reached the house, the sound of horses startled a flock of crows from the trees. They flew upward in black spirals, circling over the barn. One of the white women gasped, clutching her pearls as the men stepped down. "What's wrong with the birds?" she asked, but no one answered. Brew. Moments later, a scream cut through the air. One of the younger men had gone to the pens and seen the scene. 6 bodies sprawled in the dirt, their faces battered beyond recognition. The laughter and gossip died instantly. The men ran toward the barn. The women froze on the steps, and the slaves scattered across the yard kept their eyes to the ground. "Find who did this," the master roared. His voice trembled, not with sorrow but with outrage. He turned, pointing toward the nearest worker. "You, speak, No one would. Silence fell like a curtain. Every man, woman, and child on that land understood that speaking meant death, and yet none betrayed her. They stood as one, like the fields themselves had decided to hold their breath. Martha did not hide. She stood at the back of the kitchen house, wiping her hands on her apron. When the master's eyes found her, something flickered there, a recognition of power he could not comprehend. "You," he barked, stepping tough. "Where were you?" "In the kitchen," she said softly. Bruna's face flushed. "In the kitchen?" "Prayers. Yes, sir. Then you must have heard something." "Then it undid." "I did," she said. "I heard the bells." The man hesitated. Her calm unnerved him. He stared at her, searching for the fear that should have been there, the trembling, the excuses. But there was one. Martha's gaze was steady, her voice level. To him, she looked the same as always, a slave too simple to lie, too beaten to resist. He turned away, barking orders to the others. "Search the quarters, find who did this!" Light tore through the small cabins, overturning beds, spilling water buckets, shouting threats, but no one spoke Martha's name. When one of the white women fainted at the sight of the dead, the men grew more frantic, calling it witchcraft, rebellion, devil's work. By sunset, the bodies had been carried away, and the plantation was blanketed in fear. That night, the quarters were silent. No songs rose, no prayers whispered. Yet in that silence, something sacred stirred. The people lay awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the crackle of crickets and the slow breathing of the woman who had changed everything. Martha sat by the ashes of the stove. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes fixed on the embers glowing faintly beneath the iron grates. Each spark reminded her of a name: Jacob, Elsie, Lena, and she whispered them into the fire. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she didn't need it. The world had not forgiven those men for what they had done, it had merely allowed them to keep living. Justice, when denied too long, comes not as a whisper, but as thunder. In the darkness, a small sound broke the stillness. A child's voice, soft, trembling. "Miss Martha?" Abruptly she turned. It was a little girl from the quarters, barely old enough to carry a pail. Her wide eyes shimmered in the dim light. "Did it hurt them?" she asked. Martha looked down at her, then at the fire. "No," she said quietly. "They don't feel hurt anymore, but the earth does." "But certain." The girl nodded, uncertain, and slipped back into the shadows. Martha continued to watch the embers fade. She knew what was coming. When the sun rose again, there would be questions, punishments, perhaps worse. But she also knew that something had already changed forever. The fear that had ruled every breath of their lives had cracked. Before dawn, an old man named Peter, who had once been a preacher before they'd broken his hand, began to hum. It was barely audible at first, a low, trembling note. Then another voice joined, then another. Soon the sound spread through the cabins like wind through wheat, soft, trembling, alive. They did not sing of escape. Begun and ended. The charred remains of the Rose Hill plantation. The air smelled of soot and damp wood, the last whispers of what had once been the grandest house in the county. The moon hung high, watching her like a solemn witness. Her bare feet sank slightly into the ash-covered ground as she walked toward the hollow shell that had been the master's house. All that remained were skeletal beams and crumbling bricks, like broken ribs of a dying beast. She stood there for a long moment, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had passed. She had buried her husband, buried her son, buried her innocence, and in that burial she had unearthed something else, an unshakable resolve that the wicked would no longer drink peace, while the righteous wept in silence. The wind rustled through the skeletal remains of the sugarcane fields, now overgrown with wild grass. The silence was almost sacred, yet beneath it lingered the faint echoes of screams and the crackle of fire. Martha closed her eyes and could almost hear her son's laughter again, faint, fleeting, like a memory refusing to die. She whispered his name, and the sound was carried into the night, up toward the stars. Then she turned her gaze to the distant hills where a line of torches flickered like fireflies in motion. They were coming. The riders of vengeance, the men and women she had gathered from the shadows. Once slaves, once victims, now awakened lions. Each had lost something to the cruelty of men who called themselves masters. Each carried a scar, seen or unseen. Together they moved as one, silent, resolute, unstoppable. They gathered around her, the flames of their torches casting a golden light on faces hardened by pain and purpose. Martha raised her head high. Her dress was tattered, her hands scarred, but her spirit burned like iron in a forge. "Tonight," she said, her voice steady as stone, "we end what began in chains. Tonight, we free the land from its own darkness." Murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Some clutched rifles, others, farm tools or blades hammered from wagon wheels. Their weapons were crude, but their conviction was sharper than steel. Martha walked among them, touching each shoulder, whispering words of courage. She saw in their eyes not rage but redemption. For even in vengeance she sought not destruction, but balance, justice. As the group made their way down toward the old town, the sky began to pale at the edges. Dawn was coming. The first light of a new day for those who had spent their lives in the dark. The whitewashed buildings of Rose Hill Town stood quiet, unaware that history was about to bleed across its cobbled streets. They struck swiftly. The men who had profited from blood and sugar awoke to the roar of righteous fury. Doors splintered, shackles were shattered. The courthouse, where 1,000 false judgments had been passed, was set ablaze. From its windows, papers fluttered into the sky like burning birds. Oh! Nay of those pages landed near Martha's feet. She picked it up and read the faded ink. Property of Rose Hill Plantation. She smiled faintly and tossed it into the fire. Brie. When the smoke cleared and the last cries faded, the town was silent, not destroyed, cleansed. Martha stood at the center of it all, her torch extinguished, her breath heavy. Around her, the people she had freed wept, not for sorrow, but for release. For the first time, the morning sun rose on a world that no longer belonged to their oppressors. Martha looked down at her hands, streaked with ash and blood. They trembled again, not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of battle won. A young girl approached her, barefoot, eyes wide with gratitude. "Miss Martha," she whispered, "what do we do now?" Martha looked toward the horizon, where the fields stretched endlessly toward the unknown. "Now," she said softly, "we rebuild, but not the way they did. We plant with love, not greed. We raise our homes on truth, not lies. And when they come looking for vengeance, we will meet them not with fear, but with faith." Brie the child nodded, and Martha placed a gentle hand on her cheek. Then she turned and walked away from the ruins, her figure growing smaller against the vast morning light. Behind her, a new settlement began to stir, a place of freedom built on the ashes of cruelty. Years later, travelers passing through the Mississippi Delta would speak of a woman called the Iron Widow of Rose Hill. Some said she was a ghost, others swore they had met her, alive and radiant, tending a field of wild roses where the plantation once stood. They said each rose bloomed brighter than fire, red as the dawn of liberation. And if you stood there at dusk, when the wind whispered through the cane fields, you could hear her voice, a low, steady hum like an old hymn, reminding the earth of what it had once witnessed. "Evil may rise like a storm," her echo would say, "but it always meets the sun." So, Martha Cooper's story as not one of death, but of rebirth. Her fire did not consume, it purified. Her vengeance was not hatred, it was the reclamation of dignity long denied. The land healed slowly, bearing the scars of its sins, yet from those scars came new life. Where once stood the mansion of cruelty now grew fields of wheat and wildflowers. Children played where whips once cracked. And every year, on the day the fire began, they gathered at sunrise to lay a single rose in the soil, to remember the woman who turned pain into purpose and chains into freedom. Thus ended the tale of Rose Hill, not in silence, but in song. A hymn carried by time itself, testifying that even the darkest night cannot hold back a soul set ablaze by justice.